Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're investigating one of the rarest, most highly specific medical mysteries of the sleeping brain. Just imagine this. You go to bed feeling completely fine, right? You drift off into a peaceful sleep, only to be violently jolted awake at the exact same time, night after night, by an intense, undeniable pain in your head. Well, today, we're looking closely at this wild phenomenon. Clinically, it's known as hypnic headache, but the medical community often rightfully calls it the alarm clock headache.
Seriously, what if your alarm clock wasn't a sound at all, but a literal headache? I mean, just imagine the incredibly frustrating reality of being woken up at the exact same time every single night by this invisible, predictable pain. Patients dealing with this condition report waking up with such eerie, precise timing that the pain literally acts as an internal alarm clock. It's not a loud beeping pulling them out of their dreams. It's their own biology, just forcing them awake in total discomfort.
And that brings us to the actual clinical definition. A hypnic headache is classified as a rare primary headache disorder, and it plays by a few very strict rules. First, it occurs exclusively during sleep. Second, it actively awakens the sleeper. And third, this is important, it is absolutely not caused by some other underlying medical condition. So this definition really lays out our central anomaly here. We're talking about a physiological condition that literally waits for you to fall asleep before it strikes. Crazy, right? Now, when we look at the demographic profile, the number 50 is key. This condition predominantly targets adults over the age of 50. And the data also notes that it's noticeably more common in women. But hey, don't let that number completely fool you into thinking it's exclusively an aging issue. While 50 is definitely the typical benchmark, the medical literature shows this peculiar headache can actually strike a person at absolutely any age.
So what's the modus operandi here? What exactly happens during an attack? Well, when it strikes, the patient typically experiences this dull or throbbing bilateral pain. And by bilateral, I just mean it's happening on both sides of the head. It might spread across the forehead, throb behind the eyes, hit the temples, or honestly just envelop the entire head. This pain, it lasts anywhere from 15 minutes to several hours. Plus, it's often accompanied by some mild nausea and a really distinct restlessness. People feel this overwhelming urge to physically get out of bed. And these episodes can happen multiple nights a week or, for some really unfortunate patients, literally every single night for years.
But here is the absolutely crucial anomaly. It starts after you fall asleep. I mean, think about most headache disorders you might know about. The vast majority of them kick in while you're awake, right? You feel it coming on while you're working, maybe driving, or just chilling at home. Hypnic headaches, though, they break all those standard neurological rules. They only initiate after sleep has already commenced. That is a massive clinical anomaly that just completely sets it apart from almost everything else we know.
To really build our investigation, we first need to clear our primary suspect, which is, of course, the migraine. Because when you hear severe headache, you probably automatically think of a migraine. But look at the difference here. A migraine is usually unilateral, meaning it's isolated to just one side of the head, and it comes with severe light and sound sensitivity, plus intense nausea. A hypnic headache, on the other hand, begins strictly during sleep, it's usually bilateral, it has that highly predictable timing we talked about, and it totally lacks those severe sensory sensitivities. So we're looking at a completely different mechanism entirely.
Now, another common differential diagnosis doctors look at is the cluster headache, which is pretty infamous for its sheer severity. But while a cluster headache brings this severe, excruciating, one-sided pain along with intense physical symptoms like tearing eyes and nasal congestion, the hypnic headache operates totally differently. It's usually much milder by comparison, it's often on both sides of the head, and it just doesn't have those intense, teary, congested reactions. So we can confidently cross cluster headaches right off our list of suspects too.
To really thoroughly solve this medical mystery, though, doctors have to systematically rule out some pretty dangerous secondary causes. These are the other suspects, things like brain tumors, nocturnal hypertension, and, very importantly, obstructive sleep apnea. Actually, sleep apnea is a major one to watch out for, simply because it frequently causes severe sleep disruption and really bad morning headaches. And that's exactly why patients who are suspected of having hypnic headaches almost always need a really comprehensive medical evaluation. We have to be absolutely sure these other, potentially life-threatening conditions aren't the real culprits hiding in the shadows.
So, to confirm the diagnosis safely, doctors follow a pretty strict, actionable path. Step 1, a thorough neurological exam. Step 2, brain imaging, just to make absolutely sure there are no tumors or weird structural issues going on. And Step 3, a formal sleep study, which is also known as polysomnography. This sleep study is absolutely vital. It helps exclude nocturnal hypoxemia, which is just low oxygen at night, and it lets doctors evaluate the patient's actual sleep architecture, guaranteeing that something like sleep apnea isn't secretly triggering these sudden awakenings.
Okay, let's dive into the likely scene of the crime, inside the brain itself, the hypothalamus. While the exact root cause of hypnic headaches still remains a bit of a medical mystery, researchers heavily suspect this small, deeply embedded region of the brain. But why? Well, it's because the hypothalamus is basically the primary control center for regulating sleep and wakefulness. It manages our internal circadian rhythms, and it controls our pain pathways. So when an alarm clock headache strikes with such incredibly predictable, rhythmic timing, it strongly points to a glitch or dysfunction in this exact, precise area. And that actually brings us to the timing of the attacks themselves, specifically within our sleep cycle. There's this ongoing, really interesting debate in the medical community right now regarding REM versus NREM sleep. Current research suggests that these attacks are very often tied to REM sleep, that phase where we dream the most vividly. However, NREM-related attacks have totally been documented too. What this really highlights is a profound, super fascinating alteration in how the brain regulates pain during our deepest, most vulnerable states of rest.
So to wrap up the diagnostic phase of our mystery here, there are strict clinical criteria needed to actually definitively identify this condition. For a doctor to officially diagnose a hypnic headache, the timing must be exclusively during sleep. The action must be that it physically awakens the patient. The frequency has to be pretty darn high, occurring at least 10 days out of the month. And finally, the duration of the pain has to last anywhere from 15 minutes up to 4 hours. It is a very specific, very rigid checklist.
Now, having successfully identified the culprit, we arrive at the treatment phase. And guys, this brings us to what is easily the most surprising twist in our whole investigation. Seriously, I want you to ask yourself, how on earth do you treat a sleep disorder with something that typically keeps you awake? It sounds like a completely paradoxical medical treatment, doesn't it? Well, let's take a look at what the clinical data actually reveals.
Bedtime caffeine. Yep, you heard that right. The crucial takeaway here is that a cup of coffee, or maybe some caffeine tablets, right before bed is actually a highly effective treatment for these patients. It is wild, but consuming caffeine right before going to sleep miraculously reduces the frequency and the severity of these attacks. And honestly, the most bizarre part of the whole thing, unlike you or me, who would probably be staring wide-eyed at the ceiling until 4 a.m., these patients often don't experience any worsening of their insomnia at all. It's just this brilliant, totally counterintuitive quirk of the condition.
Now, of course, not everyone responds perfectly to a pre-bedtime espresso. So for those who don't, there are your more traditional pharmaceutical heroes. Lithium is considered one of the classic treatments. It's great at effectively reducing the attack frequency, though, it definitely requires careful, regular monitoring by a doctor. Another really strong option is indomethacin. That's a powerful prescription anti-inflammatory medication that has shown some incredibly significant and reliable benefits for a lot of sufferers in clinical settings. Let's shift gears and look at the aftermath and the long-term reality for these patients. The prognosis for a hypnic headache is that it's generally chronic, meaning it's going to persist over time. But the good news is, it is fundamentally benign. It absolutely does not cause permanent neurological damage. But hey, let's not minimize its impact here. Being painfully jolted awake night after night leads to profound daytime fatigue, severe sleep fragmentation, and it just drastically reduces a person's overall quality of sleep. It really takes a heavy, completely exhausting toll on daily life.
I actually really love this quote from the source material because I think it summarizes our journey perfectly. Hypnic headache is unusual because it begins during sleep itself, acting like an alarm clock that repeatedly awakens the brain from otherwise normal sleep. It is just such a stark reminder that while most headaches happen while we're awake, navigating our daily stressors and routines, this specific, highly targeted condition disrupts the very sanctity of our rest.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. Think about it. If our brain can literally invent a headache that acts as a precision alarm clock, completely overriding our deepest sleep states, what other mysteries is the sleeping brain hiding from us? It really leaves you marveling at the bizarre anomalies of human biology, doesn't it? It proves that sometimes the absolute most fascinating medical mysteries happen while our eyes are completely closed. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the incredible science of the human body.